Somewhere in the Arabian Sea right now, a man is standing on the flight deck of the USS Abraham Lincoln at 2 in the morning, looking at the water and wondering if he can make it over the rail before anyone stops him. That is not a metaphor. That is not a dramatization for this video. That is a documented event confirmed by 3 separate American officials to CNN, corroborated by military spouses who spoke to Military Times and Stars and Stripes, and it has happened more than once aboard a single United States aircraft carrier in the space of a few months. The ship left San Diego in November. It was supposed to come home in 6 or 7 months, which is already a long deployment by historical standards. As of the second week of August 2026, it had logged more than 250 days at sea, 40 of them in continuous combat operations with no port call. 5,000 sailors and Marines are still out there. And when the Secretary of Defense was asked about the reports of sailors trying to go overboard, he did not deny that it happened. He called the reporting completely misrepresented. The reporter who broke the story went on television and said, in almost those exact words, that the secretary was gaslighting his own force. That is where we start today, because everything else in this story, the standoff in the Strait of Hormuz, the fracture inside Donald Trump's own coalition, the quiet, bloodless campaign China is running while everyone else is shouting, all of it sits downstream of what is happening to the people on that ship. This is the story the cable news panels are not built to tell, because it does not fit into a 7-minute segment, and it does not have a clean hero. So we are going to take the time it actually needs. Get comfortable, because this is long, and it is worth it. Let's deal in specifics because vague outrage is easy, and precise facts are what actually hold up. The USS Abraham Lincoln departed San Diego on a deployment that is now stretched roughly 2.5 times longer than a standard carrier rotation. Families of sailors serving on the ship have told Navy leadership, in a meeting that drew around 200 relatives in San Diego, that conditions aboard have deteriorated badly. Moldy showers, food and supply shortages, a mail system so backed up that care packages have been lost in transit for months, and a mental health situation serious enough that multiple sailors have either attempted to go over the side of the ship or been physically stopped by shipmates before they could. One spouse told Navy officials she'd received a message from her husband saying he hoped he wouldn't wake up the next day. Another described her husband tackling a fellow sailor on watch, hauling him back onto the deck seconds before he would have gone into the water, then being flooded with an adrenaline response he said he'd never felt in his life. These are not internet rumors laundered through an anonymous Telegram channel. These accounts are attributed, on the record, to named family members, reported by outlets that specialize in military affairs, and at least one incident, a sailor going overboard, rescued within the hour, wearing a life vest, treated aboard the ship, has been confirmed by 3 U.S. officials speaking to CNN. Senator Richard Blumenthal of Connecticut, a member of the Senate Armed Services Committee, sent a formal letter to Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth and the acting Secretary of the Navy demanding answers. He cited water contamination, plumbing failures, deck safety concerns, and the deteriorating mental health of the crew as issues serious enough to warrant a government response, not a talking point. And this is where the story stops being just a human tragedy and starts becoming a political one. Because the Pentagon's public answer was not, "We are investigating," or "We are bringing these sailors home." The public answer, delivered by Hegseth in an interview, was that the reporting had been completely misrepresented, followed by a general statement about respecting the sacrifices of the men and women at sea, without directly addressing a single one of the specific allegations. Not the water, not the mold, not the food shortages, not a timeline for when the ship might actually return home. A Navy spokesperson separately said the service had not observed an increase in suicidal ideations or attempts aboard the Lincoln, a statement that families and the journalists who've spoken with them have publicly and pointedly disputed. You can hold both of those things in your head at once. An institution has an interest in not looking like it is losing control of a 5,000-person warship, and families of the people on that ship have an interest in the truth reaching Washington before someone dies. Those interests are in direct conflict, and the gap between them is precisely what this video is about. Now here is the detail that turns this from a human interest story into a strategic one. While all of this was unfolding in public, the Navy quietly ordered a second carrier, the USS George Washington, which had been stationed in Da Nang, Vietnam, to sail west across the Malacca Strait toward the Middle East. If the Lincoln's deployment were proceeding normally, if this were simply a long but manageable rotation, you would not need an emergency reassignment of another carrier strike group from the other side of the world. Carrier movements of that scale are planned years in advance, built around maintenance cycles, training schedules, and diplomatic calendars. Rerouting one on short notice is the kind of decision a Navy makes when it has run out of better options. So ask yourself the question the cable panels keep skipping past. If everything aboard the Lincoln is fine, why is the Pentagon burning fuel and years of planning to replace it early? There is a reason military historians pay close attention to signals like this, and it has nothing to do with partisan politics. When a military force stays deployed past the point its people can reasonably sustain, for a mission whose purpose keeps shifting, discipline does not fail all at once. It erodes in a specific, well-documented sequence. The German sociologist Max Weber wrote that any system of authority depends on legitimacy, a shared belief among the people executing orders that the orders are worth executing. Take that legitimacy away, and you are left governing by coercion alone, which is expensive, unstable, and eventually ineffective. The sociologist Jürgen Habermas built on this idea decades later with what he called a legitimation crisis, the moment a political system can no longer secure the voluntary cooperation of the people who carry out its decisions on the ground. American military history has one especially painful case study in exactly this dynamic: the final years of the Vietnam War. Between 1969 and 1972, the U.S. Army recorded several hundred confirmed or suspected attacks by enlisted soldiers against their own officers, a phenomenon that became known, grimly, as fragging, after the fragmentation grenades sometimes used. It didn't start with grenades. It started with smaller acts of resistance, patrols that quietly avoided contact with the enemy, sandbagging of orders, and a creeping refusal among rank-and-file troops to keep risking their lives for a mission that, to them, had stopped making sense. Historians who studied the phenomenon closely, most notably in the research collected under works like Crisis in Command, found a consistent pattern. When soldiers came to see their officers not as respected leaders, but as career-focused managers pushing them into danger to hit numbers on a report, trust collapsed. And when soldiers could no longer resist with words, some resisted with their bodies, and in the worst cases, with violence against the chain of command itself. We are obviously not there with the Lincoln. Nobody is suggesting American sailors are attacking their officers. But the earliest stage of that same pattern, a crew's core trust in the purpose of its mission eroding under an open-ended deployment, is exactly what the reporting describes, and it is worth naming honestly rather than euphemistically. Which brings us to the most uncomfortable fact in this entire story, the one clip that should have dominated the news cycle for a week and instead disappeared in about a day. Vice President J.D. Vance, appearing on Fox News, was asked what the U.S. mission in this conflict was actually for. He did not talk about preventing Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons. He did not talk about regional security architecture or defending an ally from attack. He said, in essence, that the goal was ensuring Gulf nations kept oil and gas flowing to the world economy so that Americans could enjoy stable energy prices, gas and fuel prices staying low for people back home. Sit with that for a second, the way we did at the top of this video. More than 5,000 American sailors and Marines at sea for the better part of a year, away from their families, with documented cases of people trying to go over the side of the ship, and the Vice President of the United States, on live television, framed the reason for their sacrifice primarily around the price of gasoline at a filling station in Ohio before an election. Whatever your politics, that is a genuinely remarkable thing for a sitting vice president to say out loud, and it is worth asking what happens inside the head of a 23-year-old sailor on watch at 3 a.m. when he hears it. Now let's go to the water, because the story on the Lincoln does not exist in isolation. It is downstream of a very real, very dangerous standoff at one of the most important choke points on Earth. The Strait of Hormuz carries somewhere around a fifth of the world's oil supply on an average day. In mid-August 2026, tankers connected to the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company were attacked for the second time in under a week, and the UAE publicly identified Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps as responsible. What followed was not the usual pattern of threats and denials. Iranian military spokesmen went on record declaring the strait to be, in their words, fully under Iranian management and control, not a threat to close it, a declaration that it already was closed on Iran's terms. Commercial shipping data reportedly showed traffic through the strait collapsing by something like 90% within 72 hours, from well over 100 vessels a day down to barely a dozen. Inside the Iranian parliament, hardline lawmakers pushed a bill to impose a transit tax on cargo passing through the strait and to ban any vessel with ties to the United States or Israel outright. Iran's own reformist government, under President Pezeshkian, reportedly pushed back, warning that unilaterally taxing international shipping lanes amounts to an economic self-blockade that could backfire on Iran as badly as on anyone else. A reminder that Iran's government is not a monolith any more than Washington's is. And Iranian officials laid out conditions for reopening the strait that read less like an opening offer in a negotiation and more like a public announcement that no negotiation was actually wanted. A full lifting of sanctions, release of frozen Iranian assets, complete withdrawal of American military forces from the Persian Gulf, and reparations in the hundreds of billions of dollars. You do not put a number like that on the table if your intention is to make a deal by Friday. You put a number like that on the table if your intention is to make clear you are not in a hurry, that you believe time, not force, is the weapon that will win this. Why would Iran believe that? This is where you have to look past the daily headlines and at the slower-moving architecture underneath them. For decades, American sanctions have worked because of one structural fact. The overwhelming majority of international trade and finance flows through systems the United States can influence or shut off entirely. The dollar as the dominant reserve and settlement currency, the SWIFT messaging network that clears cross-border payments, and correspondent banking relationships that ultimately run through institutions exposed to U.S. regulators. When Washington sanctions a country, it is effectively telling every bank and company on earth, keep doing business with this country and you risk losing access to ours. That threat only works as long as there is no serious alternative system to plug into. For years now, the BRICS bloc, originally Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, since expanded, has been slowly building exactly that kind of alternative. A new development bank offering infrastructure financing without going through the IMF or World Bank, and a growing set of bilateral trade arrangements that settle in local currencies rather than dollars, cutting the U.S. financial system out of the transaction entirely. Iranian officials, including the governor of Iran's central bank, have said openly that deeper integration with this BRICS financial architecture would let Tehran build trade relationships that don't have to pass through SWIFT or the dollar system at all. To be clear about scale, because intellectual honesty matters more than a dramatic soundbite, the new development bank's total capitalization is a small fraction of the World Bank's, and BRICS trade settlement in non-dollar currencies is nowhere close to replacing the dollar's dominant role in global finance. The dollar's share of global trade settlement has slipped over the past 2 decades, from roughly half to somewhere in the high 30s as a percentage, but slipped is a very different word from collapsed. What matters for this story isn't whether BRICS can fully replace the existing financial order today, it's the trajectory, and the fact that Iran's leadership is explicitly betting on that trajectory continuing long enough to outlast American political patience. Which brings the strait, the sanctions, and the Lincoln's flight deck back to the same underlying clock. Let's turn to the politics, because the war is not only being fought against Iran, there's a second, quieter conflict happening inside Donald Trump's own governing coalition, and it broke into public view during this same stretch of days in mid-August. For years, the MAGA movement has held together 2 instincts that don't always point in the same direction. One is an America First instinct, skepticism of long, expensive foreign entanglements, a preference for spending resources on the border, domestic manufacturing, and American workers rather than overseas wars. The other is a strongly pro-Israel instinct, championed by figures across the evangelical and hawkish wings of the movement, that treats unconditional support for Israel and a hard line against Iran as close to non-negotiable. Those 2 instincts can coexist quietly for a long time. They get much harder to hold together when American sailors are visibly breaking down at sea in a war whose stated purpose keeps shifting, and when there's real pressure from allies to escalate further rather than wind down. That tension surfaced publicly when Israeli officials and commentators criticized the Trump administration for pursuing elements of a negotiated framework with Iran, with some Israeli media coverage sharply mocking the administration's approach. Prominent Republican hawks in the Senate voiced sharp criticism of any framework seen as too accommodating toward Tehran, and Vice President Vance, who has generally positioned himself as a strong supporter of the U.S.-Israel relationship, pushed back publicly and pointedly, noting, in effect, that a large share of Israel's defensive weapons over recent months had been built by American hands and paid for by American taxpayers, and telling Israel's most hawkish ministers bluntly that they could not simply keep resolving every security problem through force. Whatever you think of the substance, that is a striking moment. A sitting American vice president publicly setting boundaries with Israel's government on live television. At the same time, Republican hawks were publicly breaking with the administration's approach from the other direction. When a governing coalition starts fracturing that visibly in the middle of a live war, it's not just an interesting political subplot. It directly shapes how much political capital exists to extend or end the deployment that's grinding down the crew of the Abraham Lincoln. Here is the part of this story that deserves the most attention and gets the least, because it does not involve a single explosion, a single soldier, or a single televised confrontation. While Washington and Tehran trade escalating rhetoric, and while cable news frames this as a two-actor drama, China has spent the same window of time quietly accumulating advantages across several fronts at once, not by fighting, but simply by being the stable, patient party while everyone else is consumed by crisis. Start with hardware. American forces have reportedly sustained substantial drone losses in this theater. Reporting has put the figure in the range of several dozen MQ-9 Reaper drones lost, representing a meaningful share of the fleet committed to the region, and well over $1 billion in hardware. The MQ-9 was designed for a permissive environment, slow, persistent surveillance over territory without serious air defenses, the kind of airspace the US operated in over Afghanistan or post-invasion Iraq. Iran is a very different environment. Layered air defenses, electronic warfare capability, and medium-range systems that have benefited from years of Russian and Chinese technical assistance. A slow, non-stealthy aircraft costing tens of millions of dollars is a poor match for that kind of airspace, and American military planners are reportedly relearning, in real time and at real cost, a lesson that cheaper, more numerous, more expendable drone systems will matter more in future contested environments than small numbers of exquisite, expensive ones. That shift in doctrine and procurement takes years, and every dollar and every production slot spent replacing losses in this theater is a dollar and a production slot not spent elsewhere, including, notably, on planned drone deliveries to Taiwan, which allies and analysts have already flagged as facing delay. Delayed deliveries to Taiwan don't require any Chinese pressure or diplomacy at all. They fall out automatically from the arithmetic of a drawn-out Middle East deployment. Then there's the tariff fight. In mid-August, the Trump administration imposed steep tariffs on imported drones aimed squarely at Chinese manufacturers who dominate the global commercial drone market, offering preferential treatment to allied manufacturers whose products avoid Chinese components entirely. The problem is that most allied drone manufacturers, including in Europe, rely heavily on Chinese-made components to stay cost competitive. A European-made electric motor can cost several times more than a Chinese equivalent. So the tariff regime, intended to pressure Beijing, ends up raising costs and creating friction for America's own allies first, straining relationships with European and Asian partners precisely at a moment when a unified front matters most. China, for its part, responded with its own formal retaliatory measures, export restrictions and sanctions on specific companies, playing the confrontation by the normal rules of state-to-state economic pressure in public, while continuing, through documented shadow fleet shipping activity, to purchase discounted Iranian crude that keeps Tehran's economy from collapsing outright. None of that requires China to fire a shot, station a soldier, or make a single public threat. It requires only that the United States and Iran remain locked in a costly standoff while China keeps its own hands clean and its own economy running. And then there is the resource dimension, which will matter far longer than this news cycle. China controls a commanding share of global rare earth processing capacity, well over 90% by most estimates. The specialized industrial capability needed to turn raw rare earth ore into the refined materials used in everything from electric vehicle motors to precision-guided weapons. Iran holds substantial untapped rare earth deposits. Reports of expanding Chinese-Iranian cooperation on rare earth exploration and processing point toward exactly the kind of long-game positioning that doesn't show up as a dramatic headline, but matters enormously a decade from now, when China's own domestic deposits are further depleted and it needs new sources to maintain its processing monopoly. Securing early access to Iran's reserves, at a moment when Iran has few other economic partners willing to invest, is the kind of move that looks unremarkable today and looks decisive in retrospect. Put those threads together: the drone losses reshaping U.S. procurement priorities, the delayed deliveries to Taiwan, the tariff war straining relationships with allies, the shadow fleet oil purchases keeping Iran's economy afloat, and the quiet rare earth partnership securing future supply chains, and you get a pattern that has nothing to do with luck or coincidence. It has to do with one country choosing to spend nothing while two others spend everything, and simply waiting to see who runs out first.